Hello, Stitchers. Welcome to Stitch Please, the official podcast of Black Women's Stitch, the sewing group where Black Lives Matter. I'm your host, Lisa Woolfork. I'm a fourth-generation sewing enthusiast with more than 20 years of sewing experience. I am looking forward to today's conversation, so sit back, relax, and get ready to get your stitch together. Hey friends, hey, it's Lisa from Black Women's Stitch and the Stitch Please podcast. And like I say every week, this is a very special episode. This episode is called On Pins and Needles. I love it because it's a pun, or it's punny. Get it? A funny pun is punny. Oh, I cracked myself up. I know you thought that was funny as well. Anyway, on pins and needles refers to a couple of things. One, being nervous, being on edge, being anxious is described on being on pins and needles. Sometimes also there's a physical sensation in one's body that makes your hands feel like prickly. That's another sensation described kind of as pins and needles. But for us, we're going to be talking about sewing pins and sewing needles in this episode of the Stitch Please podcast. So I want you to stay tuned. We're going to learn about a little bit of history. We're going to talk about some of the earliest examples of pins and needles known to human history so far. Then we'll dive into some really practical applications. If you are starting sewing, if you are developing or extending or deepening your practice, what kind of sewing machine needles do you need? What type of pins do you need and do you use? I would love this episode to be one of those ones that's like equipping. I will not be talking about brands of these things. I will be talking about the types, and these types are consistent across the board. It will not depend on the company if they have this particular thing. There's brands that I do like, but there are no brands currently paying for this episode. So you will be hearing some wonderful information that applies to the things that I use, because these are things that are going to be really useful. In addition, this episode on pins and needles will give you information that's relevant for your sewing practice, regardless of that level. If you're just getting started, you'll find some benefits. And if you've been sewing a long time, you will also find some benefits because there's some new things out there. There's some new technologies. There's some new needles, believe it or not, some new pins that maybe you are not aware of. And I am happy to share those with you. So let's get started. The earliest sewing machine needle seems to date back to about 60,000 years ago and was found in South Africa. There is another one that is a little bit older, which I guess must be now the actual first one, and that was about 70,000 years ago. And that is how old the sewing needle they've been able to find. When it comes to pins, P-I-N-S, when it comes to pins, there were some really ingenious materials used for pins. Thorns, I thought that they used thorns. That was really interesting. Some prehistoric folks, I think that's pretty ingenious, thinking about, it's already going to be scratching you anyway. You might as well take it and make good use of it. So thorns, I thought that was a really interesting example. In ancient Egypt, they said that pins were crafted with bronze and decorative beads. The clothes in medieval Europe, they were adorned with pins, and those pins were made out of ivory, bone, silver, gold, or brass. The use of iron wire, which is what I think pins are made of right now, it started as early, they say, as 15th century France. And if we think about it, there are some brands that are still well known in France and in other parts of Europe for making pins. One thing I found really interesting when you looked at the American contribution to the making of pins was that there was a man named John Ireland Howe, and he was a physician, and he worked apparently at the New York Alms House, Alms, A-L-M-S, and that is basically a poorhouse or a workhouse. And part of the job of what they describe here in this article, I'll include this in the show notes, what they describe in this article as inmate/patients made pins by hand. And I was reading somewhere that Once the pin factories began, they were able to exponentially create more pins. And we can see this from the early days of the pin factory, where they might make something like 5,000 and be really excited. But then as the factory started to develop, they were making 70,000, which is a massive amount of pins during a time, or not that far from a time, when they were made by hand and were very precious. So this helped to drive the price down. I believe it helped to keep sewing going. And it's one example of how industrialization shows up in sewing and starts to build it as an industry. I just thought it was interesting to note that there is a history of prison labor or inmate labor involved in the manufacturing of pins in America in the mid 1800s. Now, for the needles portion of this pins and needles episode, there is some really interesting history. So I'm minding my own beeswax at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. Who names these things? National Natural? Anywho, I was over there perusing the interwebs over at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History and came upon some bone and ivory needles from China about 30,000 to 23,000 years ago. That's a long time ago, right? But peep this. What's even older and that they've recently found are bone awls, AWLs, and perforators. Now, this was exciting to me because it said that these things were 77,000 years old, which means they are older than the needles. Because when you look at these needles, these bone needles, they are not as sharp as we are used to. And I don't see how they would perforate anything. However, if you have an awl or a perforator, you can perforate the holes, and then it makes it easier to sew with, and you don't have to have a super sharp needle like we would have today. So this was exciting to me when the Smithsonian said that awls and perforators were probably invented in Africa and then carried to colder climates where they were used to pierce holes in clothing. And that's kind of neat because really, these needles do not look very sharp. And I was just feeling kind of sad for our prehistoric sistren and brethren who were sewing with some very, very dull needles. But if they had, and I'm sure they did, awls and perforators, they were able to do just fine with the making of these prehistoric fashions. Now we're going to turn to modern times and to look at how you're going to fill up your tomato pin cushion. I talked about this in the Primp Your Pin Cushion episode, so check that one out. I really like that one. To review, your tomato pin cushion has 6 wedges. And in that Primp Your Pin Cushion episode, I invited you to look at that pin cushion as 6 wedges or spaces of possibility. For that reason, because you've got 6 wedges in your pin cushion, we're going to talk about 6 types of pins that will be useful to you when you are just getting started, or if you want to expand and reach your practice to a different level. You might have all of these tools already. And to that, I say, congratulations. You might be just beginning and want to figure things out. Congratulations also, and welcome. But we're going to get into on pins and needles, and I would always love to hear from you. So if you have some thoughts about it, thoughts about the episode, things you wanted to hear more about, please drop me a line on SpeakPipe, and I would be happy to listen to your message and, send you a message right back. Because it's called a pin cushion, we will go ahead and start with pins. Pins are an essential part of the sewing process. You need some way to affix the layers of your fabric together. And this is where sewing pins come into place. Now, I'm going to talk about 6 types of pins that will be useful for your sewing. These will give you a good overview that will cover a variety of types of sewing that you will encounter. If you choose to sew bags, great. You can use this method. If you want to sew clothing, perfect. It'll work for that too. If you want to do quilts, yep, this will also be something you can use. So here are some examples of the pins that I use that will help you create a collection of tools that will not break the bank and make sure you have what you need regardless of what you want to make. So let's get started. Number one, straight pins. These are the basic sewing pins. They got a straight shaft and they might have a round plastic or glass head. I will advise the glass head, but I can get to that when I talk about number three. These straight pins are pretty versatile. You can use them with a variety of fabrics. The second one is ballpoint pins. These are going to be good for your knit fabrics. They have a rounded tip that goes between the fibers of the fabric. It pierces them instead of damaging them. And sometimes if you have a pin that is too sharp and you are working with a knit fabric that is loose, it's not going to hold it and you're going to be frustrated. So this is the same reason that people use ballpoint needles when sewing knit fabric. It makes sense to use a ballpoint pin. Glass head pins. These are some of my favorite. There are some that are very fine and have a very fine point. These pins have a glass head, which can withstand heat because your girl loves to press. I love to press my stuff as I'm sewing. And if you pin up a hem, for example, you are not going to want to remove the pin before pressing it. So I just press it on down. And the glass, because it is glass, you won't worry about melting. Hey friends, hey, I know you're enjoying the audio version of Stitch Please, and thanks so much for listening. But you're missing out on all the great stuff going on behind the scenes. That's why I'm inviting you to join our Black Women Stitch Patreon. For as little as $5 a month, you can see all the video versions of the podcast. Plus, you get some amazing swatch cards. You know how much I love these swatch cards. Look, see how cool these are? Oh wait, you can't see them because you are not yet on the Patreon. So when you join the Patreon, you'll be able to see this, me showing you these amazing cards. We also have some great perks at the other tiers, like discounts, swag, office hours, and more. Don't be the last sewist in the group now. Head over to patreon.com/blackwomenstitch or click the link in the show notes and become a Patreon supporter today. We truly cannot do this without you. So thank you so much. The fourth type of pin is the flat flower head pin. They come in multiple colors. They have them in red, green, yellow, blue. Then they have the pastel version of that same palette. And these have that decorative head that's shaped like a flower. It makes them easy to handle and to spot. They're used in dressmaking and in garment making. That's what I use them for. And they can be easily ironed over due to their flat design. I will also add, they can be easily sewn over. And I have done that. I have actually sewn a flathead pin, a flathead flower pin into a seam of a garment and had to go back and take that out because the pin could not be sewn into the outfit. It was very annoying. This operator error I'm describing. Number 5, silk pins. These are very fine, very sharp. Silk pins are designed for delicate fabrics like silk, satin, places where you don't want to leave a hole. It can be the case if a fabric is very fine and you pierce it with the wrong pin, it will leave a hole. And that's fine if you don't make a mistake. But similar to working with leather, if you sew on some silks, even when you take out the thread, those holes will still be there. So it becomes really important to choose the right tool for the right fabric. And when you're working with satins, silks, charmeuse, these different types and different finishes, you'll want to use a silk pin. The last one is one you might already have, and that's a safety pin. A safety pin is great. It's great in a pinch. If you have something that might fall off, it's good to have one for picture day at school. You know what's going to happen. It's good to have some at prom, pinned up in your sleeve or whoever. These pins are so great. Just to describe them for those who might not know, these safety pins, they're curved. They have a spring mechanism that locks the pin in place. They're good for temporary fixes. They're good for pattern fitting. And this is one of the things that I think they're very good for, basting a quilt. Basting a quilt is much easier with safety pins than with any other type of pin. In fact, they make safety pins that are a little bit bent to curve a little bit easier into your quilt sandwich. Remember, when you're making a quilt is 3 layers. It's fabric, it's batting in the middle, and then it's a beautiful top, and it all gets quilted together. But you have to pin those 3 layers together, because if they shift, it's going to be like a terrible grilled cheese sandwich. Like, you never had a grilled cheese sandwich and you put like the cheese and then the ham and another piece of cheese, and then like the cheese like slides out the middle or something. Or like you're having like a hamburger or a veggie burger and you're really hungry, and then you like have the burger and then the veggies, and then you put too much sauce on it. So when you bite it, like your burger flies out onto the ground and then you're devastated. That's what could happen to your quilt. Do you want that to happen to your quilt? Do you want to have a terrible cookout accident where your delicious burger, falls out, falls apart? You don't want that. So get some safety pins and pin the 3 layers of your quilt. So to review, as we get from our pins to the needles section of today's episode, the 6 pins that I talked about were straight pins, ballpoint pins, glass head pins, flower head pins, silk pins, and safety pins. These are the basic pins you want to have to get started building your notions collection for sewing or quilting or anything you're going to be doing with the sewing machine. If you're new, you don't know what you want to make yet. You can make anything with this sewing machine. And if you're someone who is a quilter, you could use these other materials to branch out beyond that. If you're someone who loves making bags, you could go from quilting. If you love to make garments, you can make bags to match your garments. There's all types of stuff that you can do. These 6 notions that I'm giving you, the pins and the needles in the next segment, are designed to help keep the sewing going. That's what we want. We want to keep the sewing going. We want you to have a great time. We want you to love what you're doing. We want you to have the equipment that you need, and to make sure that there are options that will give you optimal outcomes for your sewing practice. And that is something we want to celebrate. Now that we've talked a little bit about the history of pins and of needles, let's talk about our present moment. Sewing on a domestic sewing machine will mean for 99% of all domestic machines made to be used in the home, they will be using one needle system. This needle system is designated by a set of numbers. Those numbers are 130/705 with the letter H. That way, if you happen to see a needle package and it does not have the numbers 130/705 with the letter H included, it is very likely that it will not work in your home sewing machine. And the reason it won't work in your home sewing machine is because that needle is likely for a different needle system. Perhaps the industrial machine system. There's a ton of different industrial machines that require different needles. They're faster, they're stronger, they move at a different rate of speed, they go through different layers of materials. The motors that grind them and make them move is different. The stitch formation, all of that is a bit different. So the needles will be different. In the 130/705H system, H stands for hakele, which means scarf, with scarf. And all of the needles in that system, in that 130/705H system, have a flattened shank. That is important. There's a very simple way that you can tell if you have a domestic needle or an industrial needle. If you put them on the table side by side and the needle can roll back and forth, if you put your finger on it and you push it along the table, and it rolls like a pencil can roll, or some dowel can roll back and forth along the table. If you move your finger back and forth along the top of it, that is not a domestic needle, because a domestic needle is not a true cylinder. The back of it has been shaved down and flattened so it can go into the needle bar of the sewing machine. That is the third thing that you will see on the package of needles. And as we're reviewing that, I just want to take a quick pause, and because the next section we're going to get into is also a little complicated, but trust me, it's not that big a deal. To review, when you look at the needle package, you're going to find the name of the brand at the top. You're going to find the type of needle. You're going to find the type of needle system. And then you will find a series of numbers, one on top of the other. So I'm looking at this package of needles, and it's a mix of two different sizes. When it comes to needle sizing, which is the very last set of numbers that you will find on a needle package, there are two numbers you want to pay attention to. Needle sizes are determined by two numbers. The first one is done to measure the diameter of the blade. The blade is that sticky part, the pointy end, as they would say in Game of Thrones. It's the pointy end. It's right below the shank and the shoulder of the needle, and just before the point and the tip. So that middle section is called the blade. You pay attention to diameter size because that's going to determine how much of a hole is left behind, or how much of a hole it will puncture or need in order to pull the thread through the eye and also through the fabric. So that diameter size is important. The second number you get refers to the eye size, and that helps to indicate the needle size overall. So for example, if you have a needle that is 75/11, compared to a needle that's going to be a little bit bigger, which is going to have a size 90/14. These two needles are sold in the same package because the 75/11 is just a bit smaller, but significantly when you start to look at the millimeters, than the size 14. So to review, when you read a needle package, you will be paying attention to the type of needle, making sure you are using the needle system 130/705H, and that you choose your needles based on how much power you want the needle to have without damaging or marking your fabric in ways that might not be easily reparable. Jeans needles will be much bigger and stronger than something you would use for top stitching. And that's like an important distinction to remember. But just to remember, when you're looking at the needle sizes, you will see two numbers. That would be 75/11, 90/40. Sometimes these things go together because of the way that the physics of the needle design works. But just understanding that the bigger your number, the bigger the hole and the larger diameter the blade of your needle will have. These are the needles that I use. These are needles that are currently in my pincushion. I know I mentioned these in the Primp Your Pincushion episode, but I'll go over them again because I don't believe I went through and gave a good detail or description of the needles. Now, here are the needles that I have in my pincushion currently, and I'm going to go through 6 because your pincushion has 6 wedges. So for me, ballpoint needles, these are needles that have a rounded tip that allows them to pass through fabric. Remember, we just talked about that with the ballpoint pins. It sounds ironic, or maybe, I don't know, it sounds counterintuitive, or maybe just sounds weird that you want a pin that is not sharp. It's true. There are times when you do not want a sharp pin or a sharp needle. And that is when you are sewing knits. If you have a sharp pin, it's going to like slip through the layers rather than kind of, you want it to like nestle through. You want it to go through the layers and not just poke a hole. Ballpoint needles, because the needle tip is not that sharp, it just pushes through the layers of the fibers rather than tearing them. That way, when you have the holes, those holes can be easily like brushed closed because they're not piercing the fibers. They are weaving through it. This is great for, as I said, knit fabrics, things like for your t-shirts, undergarments, spandex, etc. Though the spandex will probably be for stretch needles, which we'll get to in a bit. But things like jersey, because what you don't want to have happen is if you are using a ballpoint needle, or you're not using a ballpoint needle, you're using a sharp needle or universal needle, you will get runs in your fabric. I have seen it with my own eyes, and it is a very sad sight because once you pierce that fabric, the fibers start to come apart and it starts to unravel. There's no raveling that back together. You aren't going to sew that back together. That is a permanent strain in that fabric, and it was caused by the needle. So this is what ballpoint needles can prevent. The next one is universal needles. The name suggests universal is good for everything. These are general purpose needles. They're good on a wide variety of fabrics. You can use them for woven and knits. Again, I would always test it. A universal would never be my first choice on a knit fabric, but test it and see. They have a slightly rounded tip. It's not as sharp as a sharp needle, but it's not nearly as round as a ballpoint. Think about what you want to make and if a universal needle is going to be right for you. Now, then we go to stretch needles. This is one of my favorite needles. I love a stretch needle. And I think it's because I sew with so many knits. And the stretch needle is one of the reasons that I don't even use ballpoint as much anymore. The stretch needle is specifically designed for high elastic materials like spandex or lycra. Cotton lycra is my jammiest of jams. Almost all my drawers are made out of cotton lycra. I love it. So that's why I am a big fan of the stretch needle. Stretch needles have a deep scarf. That's the groove on the back of the needle, or not the back. It's the groove in the needle that allows the hook in the bobbin to pick up the thread loop. And because it's less rounded than ballpoint, it also has a special eye that's designed to prevent skip stitches. And that is something that happens a lot in stretch fabrics. Between the static that gets created when the needle goes through the fabric at a high rate of speed, you can get some skip stitches that way. The stretch needle is designed to prevent those skip stitches. Sharp needles are also some of my favorites. They have a very sharp point that helps them pierce tightly woven fabrics. Now, it'll pierce them in such a way that they do not run, that they do not tear. And it makes these really neat, clean stitches on fabrics like microfibers, on silks, on chintz, on, I think sometimes some fabric stores call them silky prints. They're not silk, they're polyester, but they feel really soft, though ironically they are incredibly hot because, surprise, surprise, they're polyester and they don't breathe, but they look great. Anywho, if you want to sew those jokers up and not get holes in them or get runs in them, use sharp needles. The last two needles I have to share with you are the top stitching needle. I love a good top stitch. I really do. And I love them so much that I'm willing to invest in special top stitching needles. Now, these have a large eye and a sharp point, which makes them ideal for top stitching. Because the eye is bigger, you can use slightly heavier decorative threads, and they pass really easily through that eye. And then the sharp point makes sure that your stitching is really precise and that it goes through smoothly. Those are some of the benefits of a top stitch needle. Large eye, sharp point, heavier threads, and top stitching is where you want your skills to shine. You want to top stitch your collars and cuffs and plackets if you have a button-up shirt or a shirt dress. These are the parts that everyone is going to see. And you want them to look good, a top stitching needle will help. Finally, the last needle is a quilting needle. Now, you don't know if you're going to quilt yet. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. But why not, if you're going to invest in 6 needles or 6 sets of needles to help you get started, why not get some quilting needles? You could use these for craft projects. You can use them for garments. You can use them for all sorts of things, but try quilting because it's a lot of fun. The thing that makes a quilting needle is that they are tapered to allow them to go through multiple layers of fabric and batting. They are sharp and strong, which means that they don't damage the material that you're sewing through, and you can go smoothly. You can stitch smoothly through thick layers of materials. And that is a really important part, because at some points you have the two fabrics that you've pieced together and you have that seam pressed. So that is 1, the top layer, 2, 3, the seam, 4, the batting, and then 5, the back. And if you piece the back, that could be, a few more layers. I'm not saying the entire quilt is that thick. I'm saying that all these little pieces, you're sewing over lots of different layers of thicknesses. Then when you go to add the binding, that's another layer of thicknesses. So use the needles that you've been given. Use the needles that are available to help you get the best possible outcomes. My goal here is to help you be well equipped, well provisioned, so that you have what you need when it's time to get your stitch together. To review, we've talked about pins and needles, a little bit about the history of pins and needles, where they came from and what they used to be and what they are now, and also what I'm using in my sewing room, what 6 pins, what 6 needles. But there's also a secret. So for the Patreon peeps, I can tell you the real tea. They are going to find out the brands that I use. They're going to find out the real tea and my deep opinion on pins and what I use when I am using pins and what I use absolutely instead of pins. So that's something that the Patreon folks are going to find out about. And if you are curious about these details, please check out the Black Woman Stitch Patreon. There's a couple of pins that I really do like a lot. One of these has to do with being easier to grab and to pinch than some of the others. So I'm going to tell you about these. These are made by Dritz. They have this lovely purple, soft pin at the gripper at the bottom. I have started using these and they work incredibly well. They are, they're really sharp. I think they're more of a universal style. I don't believe they have them in the ballpoint variety, but I really like this pin. It's a great pin, and I have been using that almost, more than anything else. And I hate using pins. That's the tea. I hate using pins. I do not like to use pins, but if I do use pins, that's the type I use. But typically I use clips. I will clip my layers together. Ever since clips have come around, I have been using those for quilting, for binding, which is what I believe they were first meant for. And then I use them for sewing layers of my clothing together as well, especially when using the serger, because it's strong enough to be fed quickly through the serger, but also it doesn't vibrate and doesn't come off. And then, you can't sew over the doggone clips. So it makes you pause and take them off ahead of time. So that is I think the real tea that I'm telling my Patreon folks this week. Hey, Patreon, hey. Look for those really cute purple pins that Dritz makes. They are really easy to use, easy to grab and hold on to, and get you some wonder clips or sewing clips. Lots of different companies make them, but they're really wonderful for lots of different types of sewing. So thank you for listening. I'm so glad to talk with you about pins and needles this week. Come back next time and we'll help you get your stitch together. And don't forget, let's keep the sewing going. You've been listening to Stitch Please, the official podcast of Black Women Stitch, the sewing group where Black Lives Matter. We appreciate you joining us this week and every week for stories that center Black women, girls, and femmes in sewing. We invite you to join the Black Women Stitch Patreon community with giving levels beginning at $5 a month. Your contributions help us bring the Stitch Please podcast to you every week. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your support. And come back next week and we'll help you get your stitch together.